Hi, welcome to the 14-day weather forecast. Things have been very, very mixed recently, and I think that's probably putting it quite mildly. Last Saturday I went strawberry picking, and the photo here suggests that it was quite pleasant. There's even some blue sky there. But there were some torrential downpours, and by the time I'd finished, I was absolutely saturated. Now, with that said, the picture across much of the Northern Hemisphere has been very different to the one in the United Kingdom. Temperatures here are for the United States, and if we look down towards the California-Nevada border, 49 Celsius has been shown. In fact, in Death Valley, values are several degrees higher than that. Extreme heat. It's not just the United States. This is showing forecast temperatures for Spain, 41, 42 Celsius there in much of the south, and the heat is extending across into Italy and Greece. Also, China has just seen temperatures climb to over 50 Celsius. Quite incredible. So, is any of that heat on its way to the United Kingdom during the next 2 weeks? As usual, I'm going to start with the view across Europe and the North Atlantic. The animation runs from 18 GMT, Tuesday the 18th. Quite unsettled at the outset for some outbreaks of rain there, just beginning to pull away eastwards. Winds coming down from the northwest, hence it's not particularly warm as I've already suggested. Running the animation, what we see is some showers in the short term. High pressure maybe just having a little bit more influence for a time. But then as we go into the weekend, it's all changed yet again. Another area of low pressure steams in from the Atlantic. The isobars are quite closely packed together, so the potential for it to become windy, at least for the time of the year. Further heavy showers or longer outbreaks of rain. It doesn't look great if you're planning a barbecue. Now, just running this sequence through to its conclusion, that changeable or unsettled picture remains in place, perhaps drier for a short time, but then towards the end, so Tuesday, Wednesday next week, another deep area of low pressure moves in from the west, just to keep the wet theme going. Not very summery, although I'm fully aware that quite a lot of people actually like these cool conditions, so I'm going to try and remain completely objective when discussing them, because although I much prefer the warm, sunny and hot weather, I'm fully aware that not everyone does. I just wanted to run this animation as well. It shows air temperatures at about 1,500 meters above sea level, but also what I've done this week is superimpose the jet stream profile onto it. It's shown by the mottled areas, and what we can see is that at the outset it's just pushing across southern Britain there into northwestern Europe, and the very, very warm and hot air is trapped to its south. And really, by and large, that tends to be the same pattern through the week. Areas of low pressure, as I've discussed, moving from the Atlantic, that jet stream is often tracking significantly further south than it does at this time of the year. Also, it looks quite strong, so just reinforcing the message that it's going to be changeable or unsettled for much of a period, and with the UK often sitting under the green shading, not particularly warm, at least at this level, which, as I said, is about 1,500 meters above our heads. Let's just jump back down to the surface to see the temperatures which can be expected. 15 GMT, Wednesday the 19th, forecast maximums. 21 there in central and eastern England, a few degrees lower as you head north and west. The potential as well for some rather chilly nights for this time of the year. Forecast minimums here at 06 GMT on Friday, single figures widely. Jumping ahead to Saturday afternoon to see the forecast maximums again. Well, it's not great because we've got that wet and windy weather pushing in from the Atlantic, so 15s, 16s quite widely, still a little bit warmer there in East Anglia and the southeastern corner. Monday the 24th, 21, 22 there in the southeast, values lower in the north. So the pattern through much of the first week is for it to be rather cool for the time of the year, but with the warmest conditions generally there in the southeast and East Anglia. I've already mentioned that it looks like turning quite windy again through the first weekend, and I'm just using this chart here from the Mogreps G ensemble to highlight it. The particular plot here is for Cardiff, but it's a similar story across much of the south. The strongest winds probably around the 22nd, the 23rd, maybe the 24th. Most of the runs in the ensemble here are going for between 30 and 40 mile an hour gusts. So that's as the area of low pressure moves in from the Atlantic. I don't think the winds are going to be quite as strong as they were last weekend, but nonetheless quite unpleasant, I would have thought, if you're planning a barbecue, for example, or any outdoor activities, especially with the likelihood of showers or longer spells of rain accompanying these strong winds. And just a couple of charts here from the UKV model, so the high resolution UK Met Office model for Saturday afternoon, because they give some indications about where the rain's likely to be at that particular point. So 15 GMT, what we see is a very wet pitch there across much of the north, the west as well, perhaps drier in East Anglia, the southeast, central England there for a time too. There is some uncertainty about how quickly this rain is going to be pushing in from the west. The chart on the right there shows forecast wind gusts and just really reinforces the message that I've already been talking about, that it's going to be a blustery scene for late July. The rainfall picture for days 0 to 5 in aggregate, so the charts here from the ECM and GFS models, both suggest the highest totals will tend to be in the north and the west, drier in the southeast and East Anglia. There are some differences there. ECM on the left shows more rain getting into the southeast and East Anglia than the GFS model does, but the profile is quite similar. But things change on the 0 to 10 day charts. This is very interesting because the ECM on the left there is showing a very wet conditions in southern and central parts of the UK, less rain as you head northwards, whereas the GFS is keeping the wettest conditions in the north and the west. I think those rain totals on the ECM chart there in southern Britain are very high indeed, and I'll come back to that a little bit later when I look at week 2. It is something worth picking up on. But what do the deterministic models show in general terms as we head towards the end of the first week? Are they all pointing to a rather unsettled theme like the GFS model here is doing? So Tuesday, the 25th of July. Similar then with the Canadian model, perhaps at this point high pressure from the southwest just having a tad more influence, but it wouldn't last. Subsequent frames show very much the Atlantic dominating things. The German icon also looks quite changeable. The European ECM are likewise, and finally the UK Met Office, rather an unsettled scenario been set up on this chart. So good agreement there between the deterministics. The details are of course varying, but none of them are suggesting a likelihood of it turning drier and more settled towards the end of the first week. The Atlantic remaining dominant, so changeable weather, showers or longer spells of rain. Does that continue to be the case though as we head through week 2? All about trends and probabilities, of course, at this range, not the details. Starting with the 16-day GEFS plot for London. Air temperatures across the top, slightly below the average for much of the second week, perhaps just ticking up a little towards the very end there. Something to keep an eye on as we head towards the end of July, maybe. The rain risk, well, there are quite a few spikes early on, so it's rather a wet picture, but the number of them does tend to decrease later. Just one point I'd like to pick up here as well is that I do get asked by quite a few people, why do I use the London chart here and not vary the locations in the south? Well, the reason is that during week 2, as I say, it's all about trends and probabilities, and it doesn't really make much difference if I use a London chart or perhaps one for Reading or even somewhere like Exeter or Cardiff. The general theme is quite a similar one at this range. As I say, it's just trying to identify what the likely trends are rather than the details. The 2-meter temperature data table for London, similar to the forecast I used last week, not a great deal of change here. This shade of orange is dominant, runs going for between 21 and 25 Celsius. There are a few cooler ones in the mix there, 16s to 20s, and one or two warmer ones, the 26 to 30s. All in all, though, temperatures look likely to be close to, perhaps just slightly below average overall, but that doesn't preclude the likelihood of 1 or 2 days being warmer than the average. They will be fluctuating on a day-to-day basis. Up to Manchester, a similar air temperature profile. In terms of rain across the bottom here, it's quite wet. There are more spikes than there were on the London plot, and their number doesn't really decrease later on. I'll come back to that as well just in a moment. The 2-metre temperature data table for Manchester, similar trends to the London one, albeit at a slightly lower level. 16s to 20s, very much dominant here. Up to Glasgow to conclude the journey northwest. The air temperature profile, very similar. Also, the rain profile is similar here to the Manchester plot, quite wet, and once more, the number of spikes is not decreasing. The 2-metre temperatures for Glasgow, not a great deal to say because it's very, very consistent with the previous two charts. There is more locations, there is more yellow on this data table than on the Manchester and London ones, 11 to 15 Celsius, so just really highlighting the fact that temperatures will be lower as we head northwards across the UK, at least overall, so on most days. Now, I've mentioned that on the London GEFS chart, the number of rain spikes decreased later on, whereas it didn't seem to do so on the Manchester and Glasgow ones, and that message is reinforced by these charts. I think to a certain degree at least, they're generated using data from the ECM ensemble, and they show the probability of 5 millimeters or more rain falling on days 8, 9 and 10, so the first few days of week 2. And these are reinforcing the message which the ECM deterministic rain aggregate chart I showed earlier was indicating. The wettest conditions quite possibly in southern and central parts of the UK, at least at this point. You can see the chart on the left there for day 8 shows the orange shading across much of southern and central England. That's indicating a likelihood of around 60 to 70% of 5 millimeters or more of rain falling on that particular day. Going forwards to days 11, 12 and 13, and there is now a change, an indication that it could be turning somewhat drier in the south, and it ties in quite nicely with the GEFS chart which I showed for London, where the number of rain spikes started to decrease towards the end of the second week. So perhaps, just perhaps, a signal for it to be turning a little bit drier in the south of the UK as we go through the second half of week 2. Coming back to the ECM mean pressure forecast chart for Friday the 28th of July, the Atlantic remaining dominant at this point, so winds coming in from the west, high pressure there sitting down to the southwest. It's staying quite changeable or unsettled. The mean surface level pressure data table for York from the GEFS, so going through week 2, the green shading shows fairly low pressure, so values are between 996 millibars and 1010. Perhaps there's something of an upwards trend. 1011 to 1025 has been indicated by the yellows, but really it's the oranges that you want to see if it's dry, warm and sunny weather at this time of the year that you're keeping your fingers crossed for as we head into the school holidays. And there's virtually none of it showing up at all. Just one run there at the end, at the very end of week 2, fallen into that category. As I say, all this points towards a continuation of the changeable or unsettled weather, perhaps somewhat drier in the south of the UK later on. But to summarise in more detail, week 1, it's showery for the first few days, but then as we go into the weekend, it turns wet and windy. Temperatures often close to or slightly below the average. Week 2, the mostly unsettled theme continues, Showers or long spells of rain for all parts of the UK, and there is that possibility of the wettest conditions being focused in the south of the UK, at least for the first few days. So, there we have it. Quite a poor outlook, at least in my view, but I'm fully aware that there are a significant number of people who are enjoying the cooler and wetter weather which we're having this summer compared to the heat wave which July 2022 brought. Anyway, I hope you found this video useful and enjoyed it. As ever, if you did, then please remember to hit the like button below and also consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. Also, remember that you can keep up to date with the day-to-day weather details on the TheWeatherOutlook.com website. Thanks very much now. Bye.